All right, then let's start. This is very exciting for us because it's our first webinar of our own that we're doing today. And with me is Hugo Alberts. My name is Seth Fontaine-Pennock. You probably know me from the weekly emails that I send out. And today we would like to talk with you about the topic of self-acceptance. So in this webinar, first we're going to talk about why it is that we chose this topic of self-acceptance to talk about today. Then Hugo will give you some theoretical background on the topic of self-acceptance, a little bit of science and practice, and some handy tips. And then we're going to start with the interactive part of this webinar, which is the part where you can ask questions, any relevant questions you like. That we'll then discuss in an interactive format. So for that, you can use the chat in the webinar software.
Perfect.
So let's get started.
Yes, let's do it. So why this topic? Well, I think if I could choose only one topic in the field of psychology, it would be self-acceptance. And the reason why is that I believe that everything is affected by the relationship that we have with ourselves. And I think it affects our interaction with other people, it affects the choices that we make, but it most of all affects how we feel about ourselves. And there are a lot of misconceptions about what self-acceptance is. For some people, it sounds like it's like a pity party, you think everything is okay and so on, but it's, I think, something completely different. And what I would like to do here with Seb is discuss the topic, but also hear your questions and your concerns. And I will also share some personal experiences. I work with a lot of clients, and I chose this topic also because I feel that many, if not all of my clients suffer from low self-acceptance, and more than I would like to admit myself, I suffered from low self-acceptance myself as well. In my own struggles in life, I noticed that I wasn't really a friend of myself and that I'm not accepting myself unconditionally. So this is something I would like to talk about with you guys, and hopefully we can brainstorm a bit and talk and make this very interactive, because I think this is the beauty of this medium.
Right, exactly. Okay, let's dive right in. I'll set up the slides for you.
Perfect. So while Seb is setting up the slides, I think it's important to know that in the literature, self-acceptance is often also referred to as unconditional self-acceptance. This is really important because once we start to understand the concept, we can also start to explore ways to improve self-acceptance. So I think what we should do is analyze the word unconditional self-acceptance. So it involves three components: unconditional self and acceptance. And what I want to do here in this presentation, guide you quickly through those three elements and have some discussions afterwards. Let's start by analyzing self-acceptance. So the first part is about unconditional or conditional. So if we talk about self-acceptance, we often refer to this as unconditional self-acceptance. What means conditional self-acceptance? It means that basic idea is I will be okay when. So there are conditions to be specified. And those conditions, where do they come from? Well, there are many actually sources that provide those conditions, those standards that we apply to ourselves. When we grow up, we enter this world and we have no idea, we have no concept of self yet. But many people, and I put some examples here, they tell us this is what a good human being looks like. So for instance, at church, we get certain values and ideas, but also at school, we place a high value on high grades and mathematics and language, or predefined standards that are being associated with being successful in life or being good in life. But also the next image, the right image here, is on the ideal of beauty. So what is it to be beautiful? Good people are beautiful, successful people are beautiful, thin people are beautiful. It's a very pervasive idea in society. But also our parents, they transfer a lot of ideas about what it is to be a good human being to us. They carry their own, luggage, you could say, from the past. And they also transfer this to us. At work, there are rules at work, standards at work, and so on. But all those things, what we do is we internalize them. So as we grow up, we get all kinds of rules and that we are not aware of. It's most like it's like a computer that is being programmed with rules of calls, if then, if then, if then. And the interesting thing is that the conditions to be a good human being are, they differ greatly among people. Some people, they see like beauty as something they have to live up to, whereas for other people, that is not something they considered to be a standard, right? So these are just a few examples, but this is actually a very important thing to remember, because this is the programming that actually prevents ourselves from accepting ourselves. So what happens is we start to look at ourselves, as this picture shows here, through the lens of all those standards. So this is what happens. When we grow up, we start to look at ourselves and use those standards. For instance, like successful people are rich, thin people are beautiful, less than perfect is not okay. Those are all ideas that we often adopt from our environment, outside in ideas that we take and live by. But not only look at reality from, we use those ideas to judge people, but also judge ourselves. And this is the basic process.
So what you're saying is that we are not looking at ourselves as we are, but we're looking at ourselves through this filter of everything that we should be, according to all of these outside sources.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that as long as you're complying to those norms, as long as you're fulfilling the standard, if you meet the standard, if you're doing okay, nothing is wrong. We feel okay, we feel good. So this is the tricky part here. People can score really high on what we call self-esteem. They say, I'm high in self-esteem, I believe I can do things, and so on and so on. But scoring high on self-esteem doesn't mean somebody is also having a high level of self-acceptance. And this is where it gets really interesting. So what is self-esteem then? Self-esteem is actually self-evaluation. It's evaluating yourself. And if a person is evaluating him or herself according to the standards that he has created for himself, and he's meeting those standards, he said, I'm okay, man, I'm really happy the way I look and the way I'm doing, my self-esteem is high. But how can we uncover self-acceptance? This is when we're not able to meet the standards anymore. Then self-acceptance kicks in. Because if you're not able to be beautiful again, or when you fail at work, how do you treat yourself? And how do you react towards your own failure?
Is this maybe what can explain the sudden crisis or burnout of a very successful person who's always been doing super well, also in terms of mental well-being, and then something goes wrong, maybe a little thing, right? Especially if they're perfectionistic, and their whole image of themselves changes, and apparently, even though they have high self-esteem, they are unable to accept themselves.
Exactly. And why? Because self-esteem is not about relating to the self. It's about self-evaluation. So the core mechanism behind self-esteem is self-evaluation. The core mechanism behind self-acceptance is relating to the self, like how you relate to a good friend of yours. One of my best friends once told me that when I asked him, like, what is the goal of your life? He said, well, my goal is to become a better friend of myself. But I didn't really know what he was talking about back then. But now I'm older, I really know that he actually was talking about this very process of cultivating and accepting relationship with the self, with himself in this case.
Okay.
So this is basically what those conditions do. So we start to look at ourselves and other people through those lenses, I would say, of the standards that we create. So what is the self? Well, this is, of course, the most difficult topic because there are so many theories on the self. But I think when it comes to understanding self-acceptance, I think there are two versions of the self that are really interesting here. And this is what I want to discuss here. So first of all, we can make a distinction between what we call the self as story. So in this field of research, they say, well, the self is a conceptual self. We create a self as we grow older through the stories that we hear from other people about ourselves. Other people tell us, like, you're doing a great job, you're looking good, you're successful, whatever. And we adopt those stories.
And we internalize them.
And we internalize them, exactly. We make them, like, we treat them as the truth, right? So it's basically the answer to the question, I am. So if you ask people, like, tell me a bit about yourself, and then people can, go on for hours. I am, because I'm Hugo, I'm so old, I have this, I do this. So they come up with a lot of stories about who they are, what they possess, and so on. But it's basically narrative. So these theories on the self, they're also called like the narrative selves or the conceptualized self. These theories all use the same principle. It's basically, if you want to put it simple, it's the mind, the cognitive mind, the thoughts that are being created here that we believe about ourselves, who we are. It's a narrative self. So we create a storyline, and a concept of ourselves, and it's often very fixed. Of course, it's almost like a written piece of work that defines who we are.
Yeah, right. I can imagine, looking at a photo of yourself from when you were 6, for example, and then you look at the photo and you say, "That's me," or at least that was me, and then the whole amount of time that passed between the moment that photo was taken and now, you make up for that time with a story. You say like, well, this happened, and then I graduated, and then I went to the university, and then I did this, and there's this, like, in this peak end theory way, you pick certain events from your life that you deem relevant enough, and those events then make up this story that tell you who you are.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And this is the story that you share with other people, and you repeat that story, and it becomes so true. And it can be positive, negative, or a mix, that depends, of course. For some people, it's very positive. For some people, it's negative. For some people, it's 50-50. But it's always a story. It's words. We use words to define ourselves. And here is the biggest problem, because a word, per definition, is a reduction of reality. A word can never grasp reality. You can go on talking about yourself for hours, but it will never fully capture the essence. And this is the limitations. So this is the self story. But there's an interesting other alternative. There's past and future. So this can only exist when there is a concept of time here. So you have to have some time. You have to say, well, this happened, and therefore, or in the future. The self story cannot exist without time. You have to have some time perspective. It's created. And this is why little kids, they don't have a very strong self story yet, right? They have not created a very strong narrative, but as they grow up, it becomes stronger. And there is the alternative, and this is what we call the selfless process. So what is the selfless process? This is, I think, where it gets interesting, because this is the self beyond words. It's a self that cannot be described by a rational mind, but it's only something that can be experienced. So it operates at an experiential level. So you could say it's basically you in this very moment. And I think if you look at your own life, you were talking about this kid, right? 6 years old. Inside of you, there is the same person that was looking with the same eyes as that kid back then. You were then you already. You were the you already then. There's nothing changed in the way you added experiences, but there is the same observer, the same person looking through
the consciousness.
The consciousness, exactly. And this is actually what we're talking about here: the awareness of things. And this is, of course, always changing. That part of you is always changing. You're not the same. It's not a fixed story. It's very dynamic. It's always, and yet it is very the same in the way as well. It's both. It's always changing because your experience is always changing, but there is always also the static part of you that is, there like eternally. It's there. It's just witnessing, right? Yeah. So it's a bit maybe difficult to explain.
Yeah. Let's not dive into the hard problem of consciousness. We've been having some discussions about this and about the existence of a soul or hard materialism and whatnot.
So let's not do that. But the interesting thing is the selfless process, you can only connect to it in this very moment. And the funny thing is, as soon as we start creating stories about ourselves, we're losing it, because we're in that moment, we're creating something in our mind again. So we're not having contact. We're losing contact with this very moment.
Right.
So to experience the selfless process, you have to experience, whatever you feel in this moment, and so you have to really be here now. This is the only way to experience it.
You know what this reminds me of? Remember when we were in Montreal last summer, and we went to Martin Seligman's talk, and at some point he said, anxiety is nothing more than thoughts about either the past or about the future, but anxiety is never anxiety about the here and now. And I thought that was very interesting, and it relates very much to the self as process, which is being yourself in the moment, rather than describing yourself as what you were in the past or what you are going to do in the future.
Or what you will be in the future, or what you should become. And here is also a lot of fear attached. So what is fear? Fear is the thought that something might happen that you think you need and that this will not happen. So you believe that something that you think you need will not happen. This is what fear often is. And so it's often projected into the future.
Whether that is approach or avoidance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is basically the two selves. So move through this very quickly. I can go on for hours on this topic, but just to give you a very brief guide through the whole concept. So what is acceptance? This is the final part of unconditional self-acceptance. Acceptance actually means that we allow things to be as they are. I think that is what acceptance is. You allow things to be as they manifest themselves in this very moment. And also when you look at the scientific definition of self-acceptance, it is allowing positive and negative to be present and creating room for this to be present, to know your own strength and your weaknesses and to be okay with that.
Right.
So this is the process of acceptance. And of course, we can only accept, this is something you do in the here and now. We allow things to be present, whether this is a thought about the future or as you are now, but it's always something that you do in this very moment. So acceptance is a stance. It's a relational stance. When you accept yourself, I think the easiest way to understand it is like if you take the image of someone that you hold very dearly, love very dearly, somebody you care for. Often you accept that person. You just love him for who he is, even if this person makes mistakes or if he fails and so on. This is what basically this relational stance is. But this is something we often don't do with ourselves. We're often very critical and so on. So basically, self-acceptance, very simply, is I'm okay. I'm okay. Not when, that would be conditional, but I'm okay.
For now, I'm really interested to hear from you. Questions you have about self-acceptance, maybe some struggles that you've had in the past with this. Anything that's relevant that you want to share or that you want to ask, please feel free to do so. I'm opening the chat window right now to look at some of the questions.
Yeah, in the meantime, I can share some personal struggles that I had with self-acceptance. In my own past, I was, when I was like 4 or 5 years ago, I was quite happy with my life. I would say I had a lot of high level of self-esteem, but back then, something happened that actually caused me to not be able to work anymore. I think it was something like a burnout, you could call it like that. And at that moment, I had to stop teaching. I couldn't, be with my son anymore, and so on. So a lot of things that I believed were me and were important to be good enough just fell away. And what I noticed is that at that moment, I felt so horrible about myself. I couldn't live with myself anymore. So before that, I was perfectly happy, and suddenly, I was a mess. And later on, I started to realize that I wasn't living up to my own expectations, and this is what was missing. I wasn't accepting myself. I wasn't allowing myself to fail. It's human. We're human beings, I think that's the whole point of acceptance and self-acceptance. It's okay to fail. It's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to, mess up.
Yeah. Irvin Yalom, whom I'm a big fan of, he has this phrase where he says, "Welcome to the human race." As soon as a client opens up and tells something about maybe a failure or about a peculiarity, and he says that phrase to essentially make them feel like this is completely normal. I am experiencing this myself as well. We all do as humans.
So this is also what I often do in coaching with people. I'm very vulnerable.
Right.
I show them what my struggles are. I show them my fears. I tell them that I'm afraid.
It makes you relatable. I feel like that contributes to the therapeutic alliance you have with the client, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the interesting thing is many therapists would say that it's not very professional. You should have some kind of a distance, but that's a different approach, I think. I think it's beautiful to connect to people and to show them that it's that very suffering that connects us.
Yeah, right. I was thinking about this a while back, and I was writing this piece, and what came to mind was like, in therapy, there are always two suffering human beings inside one room. And hopefully it's the case that one of them has been trained and educated to help the other person with this, but that does not detract from the fact that in therapy, there are two suffering human beings in one room.
Yes, always. And I think when we were talking about what acceptance is, and you take that approach from the self, like the rational, talkative approach, stories creating, and so on, I think often acceptance also means just being in silence with somebody, just not talking and just being together. Sometimes when you feel really horrible, sometimes the only thing you want is to be with somebody that gives you a hug and not says anything, just allows you to be with your suffering, with your pain, with your crying in that very moment. And I think this is why when you use self-acceptance in therapy, I think I'm a big fan of just being with people as they are and not trying to solve it. So here we get to a really interesting part, right?
Yeah.
Because what we do as a therapist or as a coach, whatever you want to call yourself, we try to fix people, heal people. But automatically what we do, we put ourselves in a different position. Like, I'm here to fix you. But there is nobody or nothing to be fixed, Fixing is always the idea there is something that this person must become good again, But in my eyes, everybody is good already. The moment you were born, you were good as you were. It's stupid, right? If you think of it, it's like as if I told you, like, Sep, if you get a decent job and you get a lot of money, then you will be okay. This is not something you say to your child. You love him unconditionally. Yeah. But as he enters society, he gets this idea that there's constantly something that he has to do to become there.
Right. So, but if I'm already good enough as I am, then what is the therapeutic process about?
I think to allow people to see what is, first of all, blocking them from that relationship. So here, actually, you get to the point, how can we increase self-acceptance? I think a very powerful way is first to allow people to see what is blocking them. And those are all the standards that people have, the rules they have created for themselves.
Right.
So in therapy, often what I also do is I ask people to write down all the rules they can detect during the week. And how can you find out the rules that you have, your own programming, your own standards, by noticing when you feel really horrible about stuff.
Right.
Because in many cases, you're breaking a rule,
Okay, before we dive into
sure.
all of the practical tips,
Sure.
we were going to take some questions, so I'm going to read some of them out loud now.
Sure.
Let's see. What can you do when you know you should be in self-acceptance, but you revert back to your story? That's the question.
Beautiful. I think the first thing is always to train yourself to know when you're in a story mode. I call this the story mode. It's like the mind creating literally a story again. Oh my God, it's not going well. It's not working. That crap, that bullshit. It's all stories, all words. The easiest way to get back, I think, or to get out of that mode is to connect to this moment. And how can you do that? In many ways. Simply by closing your eyes and breathing. Just noticing your body, feeling your body, going outside, have a walk, connect to this moment, the experience in this moment. I think this is a very powerful way to get out of it. It's always staying out of it's always staying out of that creation, the mind creation mode, because in that case, the rational mind, the story is using you. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I think what we've trained ourselves to do nowadays is to escape the self.
Yes.
So what we do is we either, go out and have a drink with friends. Some people use recreational drugs, watching Netflix, being on Facebook. We've all these different means, and often a combination of them, to escape the self, to escape the possibility of being alone with yourself, without your smartphone, in the moment. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about it. How many times a day, like a normal person in this day and age, how much time do they spend alone with themselves? Even if they're waiting for the bus, the smartphone is out and they're checking something, consuming a podcast, listening to an audiobook, whatever it is, in order not to be with the self, right?
Yeah, and it's all outside in. And this is, I think, also when you talk about cultivating more self-acceptance is not outside in. It's not complying to norms. It's not something outside yourself, but it's inside out. It's connecting to yourself and moving on from there. So it's noticing what you feel, and even what I also often do, and I think this is something I learned from Seth. You were talking about the story mind. Write it down. When you write down your stories, you can literally observe them. So you can literally act as the observer, as the self process, looking at the stories.
Right.
What's going on in your mind, and then you're detached. So part of it is also becoming more detached from that storyline.
Yeah, I mean, let's say you're writing a book, or you're an architect, for example, and you're developing this big building or something, right? how do you do that? What is the process? It doesn't take place in your mind. Maybe the first stage, maybe conceptually you're getting some inspiration, that takes place in the mind. But as soon as you have it and you want to make it more concrete, you write it down.
Yep.
You make the drawings, you put it all on one big desk or on a whiteboard or something, so that you can take an objective look at it, look at all of the pieces, see what needs to be left out, see what is still missing. And I think if you're taking self-reflection and introspection, if you take that seriously, then the way to do that would be first to get it all out there, to write it down. So this is what I do, at least, with the self-reflective writing. I write it down, and then once in a while I'll reread it. It's like keeping a journal. And then once in a while you read it back, and your self-image becomes apparent.
Yes. You actually write down a bit the story that you create about yourself, and the beliefs, the thoughts that you have about other people. I think in the third wave therapy generation that is now very popular, like acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness and those approaches, they all try to strengthen that observing self, that ability to stay away from that story that we create about everything and everyone and about life itself mostly.
Right. So I see a lot of questions coming by as well. So there was one about betrayal and divorce. So I guess this person was aiming at how can you still accept yourself after you've been betrayed by your partner and you're in a serious divorce. I mean, of course, this is really, it's more a bit more towards the clinical side, maybe, because it can be a very traumatic experience.
Yes, very good question.
But how do you accept yourself in that situation?
Very good question. So many people, when they hear about self-acceptance, they agree it's a beautiful topic and we should all accept ourselves. But the basic question is always, how the hell do I do it? The problem is that if you approach it from a rational point of view, you're getting stuck in the very same process where it is created, right? Because you started to make, I have to accept myself. I know I should accept myself. And then you start putting notes on your mirror saying, I'm good enough. I like myself, self-affirmations. But what you're doing is you're creating a new sense of self through another story and so on. So I think to really start practicing self-acceptance, it starts with allowing yourself to feel whatever you feel in this very moment.
Yeah, we've been talking about this, right? The role of feelings versus the mind taking over, and more, because I've always had a rational approach to things, and analytical, of course, with my work and everything, and more, thanks to you and thanks to Saskia as well. I've learned the importance of looking back inside of me and just in the moment try to discover what I'm feeling.
Yes. And I think giving room again, providing room for that to unfold. Because what is preventing us? What is preventing most people from feeling what they feel? It's simply the idea that it's not okay to feel this. How many people have rules, like standards, like showing, crying is a sign of weakness, or I should not feel this or that. Those are all rules, standards, rules of lines of programming, if you want, that prevent us from actually being. Because who is accepting who, right? Self-accepting. Self-acceptance, who is accepting who? I think it is yourself in this moment, allowing yourself to be as you are.
Exactly.
With everything that is present right here. And if this is pain, this is pain. And if this is joy, this is joy. But whatever is there. Yeah,
so there's again that element of non-judgmental awareness, or a non-judgmental way of being in the moment and feeling.
I think there is a difference between telling yourself that you should accept this and really connecting to that experience, just closing your eyes and for a moment feel what's going on.
So let's go back to the example and to the question. Imagine being in that situation of betrayal and divorce. How can you then, because oftentimes I can imagine, if someone has been betrayed, it's more of a challenge to accept themselves, because how can they have not seen that coming, right? There are all these things that you can take personal about it as well, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about that and that situation?
The thing is a bit difficult, because I want to ask a bit more here. I want to ask some further questions. So because what is What makes it so difficult to accept yourself? What is preventing you? What is the emotion that is most strongly represented here, for instance? What is blocking you from doing that? What are the thoughts that come up when you think about this event?
Right.
Like, is it, and this is, so it's.
So what would your approach be? Let's say this person would come to you with this question, you would be their coach. What kind of question, what kind of answers would you try to get?
No answers. I would like to know. The first thing, I'm not so interested in hearing the full story, because what often happens is that people come to you and they start talking. I had once a client who started, oh my God, like 20 years ago, my father did this, and then therefore I developed this kind of problems, and now so it was a complete storyline about all causalities, how this happened and this. And the thing is, maybe that's true, or maybe it's not true, or part of it is true. I don't know. So this is something I try not to focus too much on the stories that people create. But what I'm really interested in is, first of all, how you're feeling at this moment. So and how do you deal with that feeling? And most people, if they're becoming a bit aware of what they're doing, they notice that they're actually not allowing themselves to feel what they feel. They try to get rid of it. They try to talk a lot to friends about what happened, or they try to, make sense of it, or being angry. But it's always an attempt to not feel what is present.
Right.
Subtle. It can be very subtle, and you can even read books about spirituality or self-acceptance to not feel it.
Right.
Solve it.
Right.
It's always about solving. It's always about, and this is the biggest paradox in coaching, I think. We sometimes we believe that we have to solve the issue. We have to solve the puzzle here, right? There is a math problem to be solved. This is my client. But it's not like that, in my opinion. I think there is nothing to be solved, as if there is somebody who is doing something wrong here. I think you can help people to, become more in line with what they feel and allow this to unfold.
Right. So maybe even to allow them to suffer, so that after that process of suffering, healing can start to take place.
Exactly. But if you cannot heal what you cannot feel, as long as you're blocking it, you cannot really go through it. You have to go through it. So what I often do with clients is, as I said, like being silent and ask them to go to that feeling. And sometimes they start crying, and I'm there with them, but I'm not fixing them. I'm not telling them what to do, but I try to resonate with what they feel. I say, okay, I notice this is quite difficult for you. Yes, it is. I can imagine, it must be very difficult. I meet them where they are,
Right.
And this is, I think, the essence. If you meet people where they are, they can maybe do this to themselves as well, meet themselves where they are, not where they should be, but where they are in this very moment.
Right.
And this is for me the essence, but also the most difficult thing in life, because of the programming that we all receive.
Right. We're gonna go on to jump into some more questions.
Sure.
All right. Berber is asking, if you work with clients, where do you start to empower self-acceptance, especially in therapy, while helping clients that they have very less self-awareness of themselves, as the self as a process? I think we've just been talking about this, but maybe you can tell some more about it.
I think what you're giving the answer a bit yourself here, because it's about awareness. The first step is always making people aware. And, often it's a leap too far to start immediately by saying you should accept yourself, you should work on that. The first part is always, I think, becoming aware of you're not accepting yourself, the conditional part. So what is the programming that you use for evaluating yourself? And this is what I work with. This is what we write down, and I ask people to notice as many programs, if you want, that are running throughout the week, and then discuss them and move on from there and see, okay, so this is going on, and how do you feel about it? How do you feel? How does it make you feel? You see, what I also, but it depends a bit on the type of client, of course, but a very mean trick that is also very effective often is if people have children, and most of my clients, they really love their children. But they suffer from low self-acceptance, and then they're beating themselves up and being very critical and so on. And I ask them, like, how do you hope your child would treat him or herself in that very same situation? Right. And then they often give a completely different answer. No, I hope they would be kind to themselves. But what kind of example are you setting here? And this is for many people, this is like a wake-up call. Like, my God, I'm actually.
That's the golden rules, like, right? Don't do unto others as you won't have them do unto you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then I think I read it. Someone called it the platinum rule. Maybe it was Tal Ben Shahar who said, like, don't do unto yourself what you wouldn't do unto others. It's this principle, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, to others, I would add to others that you deeply love.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's all about the relationship that we have with ourselves.
Yeah.
But it can be a very long process. I have had clients who are very low in self-acceptance, and I sometimes use like schema therapy approaches. Allowing people to connect to that inner critic, and let that part of them speak and say, well, okay, I want to talk to the inner critic. What has he to say about this very situation? Tell me a bit more about that. And then they start talking from that role and say, well, it's horrible what you did and you're a loser and so on. And say, okay, now let's shift to another perspective. Shift to what would the self-compassionate part of you say, or the understanding part, whatever you want to call it. So there are many approaches, of course, but I think it's the starting point for me is always to help people see where it's not working, because then there is also like a natural motivation. It's not about convincing people. My job is not to convince you that you should develop self-acceptance.
Right.
It's for them to see the urgency and also later on experience the difference between critically moving through life and beating yourself up and allowing yourself to be as you are. I think this is a process, and as soon as you start to notice the difference, you can also see the benefit of becoming more kind to yourself and not comparing yourself constantly to other people. No.
Right. Okay. Peyman Amadi is saying, in my view, as human beings, not only thoughts, but also our positive and negative emotions. And every human being can have any emotion, but when the mixing of thoughts and feelings happens, the problem arises. So you must have all the emotional characters and be aware of our personality. Do you understand what she means? So you must have all the emotional characters. I'm not sure if I understand what it means. And be aware of our personality. Maybe if you can ask the question a little bit more concretely, I'll just move on to the next question, because we have lots of questions here still. Let's see. Okay.
Beautiful. Yes. Yeah. So Antonella, you say, is it that you're saying it's better to shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, and this is how you can start? I think this is beautiful. Actually, I created also a list of things that you can do to cultivate self-acceptance, and the growth mindset is one of them. Why? Because it's actually quite simple if you consider it. It's like a grid. The rational mind, with all its standards and rules, what it does, it creates like a grid, and it says, this is how life and other people and myself should be. And if you perfectly match the grid, that's fine. If you not match the grid, that's wrong. You're either right or wrong. So it's a very dichotomous way of processing. But in a growth mindset, there is no losing. It's always growing. It's always like you can learn from your mistakes. If you take the example of the PowerPoint presentation that failed, I can say, oh my God, it's horrible. I messed up, and it should have never happened. We should have prepared this better, and so on. We're stuck basically in the past.
Right.
But we can also say, well, we can learn from this. Next time we will not do it this way. So we will not make this mistake again. Yeah. So it's all about, again, relating to your mistakes. And the one is fixed. It's stuck in the past. It should never have happened. We're idiots. It's fixed. You can hear the fixedness here, right? The other is dynamic. We can grow. We can learn from this. So it's always moving. So for me, the dynamic part is really important.
Right. It's also more future oriented. Yeah. Yeah,
and also more. I think in line with the ever-changing nature of yourself. You're not the same. We're not. After this webinar, we're not the same anymore. And yet we are at the same time. But it's a bit of how you define the self.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's move on to some more questions here.
Sure.
It's cool to see the interaction taking place here between people as well. I like the concept of treating yourself as your own firstborn. Raise yourself with love and compassion. Help yourself navigate boundaries. comfort yourself
Yes.
when you're upset, says Lynn.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it's when my son was born. Like 5 minutes after he was born, I told him like two things: be a friend to yourself, love yourself for who you are, and the second one was follow your heart. Follow your passion. Things like live inside out. Follow your own dreams rather than a life that other people want you to live. This was because I believe those two things are the backbone of a meaningful life.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And so the child part is really beautiful. I think this is when we become like children. I think we become more like the unprogrammed version of ourselves, less caught in the grid of the programming matrix around us. Yeah.
Right. I hear you say the matrix, but next webinar will be about mindfulness and the matrix we live in.
The Matrix is the best movie I ever saw, and the Matrix is all about this process of the narrative self, in my opinion. The programmed world that we all live in that has been pulled over our eyes to blind us from the truth.
No more coffee for you, man. You're going to be quoting
Sorry.
the Matrix all the time. Madalena says, how can I help people who live with persistent pain to develop self-acceptance?
Well, very good question. That's a very good question. The problem with pain, I assuming you're referring to physical pain here.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure.
Because
maybe it's psychological pain, maybe a combination.
The problem with pain is that it affects everything, of course, and let's assume it's physical pain. The problem is when pain gets very intense, automatically it creates thoughts. About this is not the life I wanted. What did I do wrong? So you can get easily caught up in a spiral of not wanting, and so on. And it's really, really difficult. But again, if you look at the process, I think the early work of Jon Kabat-Zinn, where he was working with people with chronic pain and so on, and mindfulness, I think beautifully demonstrates that even I can share a link if you want later on. Even for people that have chronic pain, it is possible to be present in this moment with the self and the pain. And this is, of course, a very difficult job, and it's not a quick fix or whatever, but it's always relating to the self. And if the self is in pain, it is relating to the self in this moment with the pain.
So it's about zooming out one level.
I think it is, yes. Well, zooming out, maybe it's even zooming in a bit, like connecting to what is right here, right now.
Right.
And the process of pain is really complex, of course, because if you say if somebody is in constant pain, self-acceptance is easier when we have pain sometimes, right? But constant pain, I assume, it always asks attention. And in those cases, it can also be very powerful just to not pay attention to the pain and just, distract yourself for a while, do something that is valuable, not get completely absorbed in the pain.
It's also a general, this case is pretty general question, yes, right? Yes. So I think the devil's always in the details with these things, and the more context you have, the more you can say about it.
Yes, exactly. So I should know more about this person, what he's struggling with, what kind of pain, and so on, to fully answer the question.
Right.
But I think it's also relating to the pain. This is also what we see in pain research. A lot has to do with how we relate to pain, rather than controlling.
Okay, this is an interesting question from Jeff.
All right.
Jeff asks, the world of work often has very high standards and pressures, which often make people feel they are not good enough. Yes. How do we reconcile this to stay sane?
To stay sane?
Yeah.
Beautiful, wow.
So the standards in the workplace. Yeah.
Yes. So what we're dealing with here is very outside in, right? You enter a workplace, and I see the whole concept of the self as a story as like a theater, and we all play roles, and there's nothing wrong with those roles, because when you're at work, you're the professional, and when you're at home, you're the lover or the husband or whatever. Those are all roles, right? And the problem is not the role, but if we identify with that role, if we believe that this is who we are, right? So this is the story. I am a businessman, or I am a psychology professor, or whatever I am, right? So this is when we mistake the role for who we are. I think then it gets really problematic. So what happens if you enter the workplace with a lot of rules and so on? It's easy to get, to believe that this is reality, that this is really true. All those rules are important and this is who you are and so on. But you're playing a game there. And this is, I think, what frees me a lot of the times. It's unlike an actor. I play that role, but I'm not the role. If I can relate to the role as an actor to his role, I can put off, my costume and leave it. The problem becomes very intense when we start to confuse the role as an employee with ourselves.
Right.
And that's why I found it so important to discuss that self is a story versus self is the process. You are not the role. You can lose your job, but there is still a you there. That's the self process. You can lose all those things. So I think it's really difficult to change the rules often in a big organization, for instance, but you can relate differently to those rules. So this is the process, I think, that is very important here, to see the rules and see them for what they are. They're arbitrarily created standards. They're not objective standards.
For a certain role that you're playing in a certain environment.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there is a difference between the standard and you meeting or not meeting that standard. But people confuse themselves with role and role that should get the standard, and then you're playing actually a game without knowing it.
Yeah. This reminds me of the Jim Carrey video that we saw a while back, right? He was explaining how the word depression, how it contains deep rest. So if someone is depressed, he is in need of deep rest. And what he was saying is that we're all actors and we're playing different roles in our lives. And sometimes we've played a certain role of businessman, for example, in this case, up to such an extreme point or with such high standards that role is in need of deep rest. Yeah. And that is what depression is. Of course, it's a bit poetic, but I thought it was a beautiful way of putting it, right? That maybe I've played too much of that role. And I'm gonna take it easy on regarding that role, and play some other roles, maybe the role of a father or of a friend, but still knowing that you're playing that role. I think it's the identification that is problematic often. Right. We're confusing ourselves for the roles that we play. Right. So it's not an actor playing a role anymore. It's like the actor is the role, and that is the person behind it. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with playing a role. We all play roles. When you go to a restaurant, you play the role of a customer. Or to a shop or whatever, or at work you play the role of an employee. There is nothing wrong with it, as long as you know it's not you. This is, I think, the biggest problem in coaching people. If you identify yourself with the role of a professional, here I am, suddenly you get the client. What is the client, or who is the client connecting to? The client is connecting to a role. And this is where it becomes, you can feel the distance between people. And this is why I personally like to be as much aware of my own role and just sit there as a human being, and connect to that person. Yeah, beautiful. Let's move on. Okay, someone Manish is agreeing with Jeff. It's a question a lot of people are struggling with, like the high standards in the workplace, when it makes a lot of sense. Let's see, let's move on. David says, understanding that we are the output of brains, we can begin to understand how the machine works. Growth begins with understanding that thoughts are more controllable than emotions. The result of thoughts and emotions is behavior. Okay. Thoughts are more controllable than emotions. Yeah. Then try not to think about the white bear for 1 minute. Let's go, man. Let's show me. No, I don't think that's possible. I think you cannot control thoughts and you cannot control emotions. You can push them away, you can modify them and so on, but this is the paradox of control. The more you try to control it, the more you try to control thoughts, the more thoughts occur. This is one of the basic ideas behind the paradoxical process of control. The more you try to suppress emotions, the more intense they often become. You call this like the rebound effect. They come back and often stronger than before. If we try to not think about something, we try to think about it more often.
So I think this is why it's so problematic to try to solve the issue of self-acceptance at a cognitive level, adding more cognitive content to yourself. I should be accepting myself. There's another standard introduced.
Yeah, right. It's a paradox that you have a mindfulness and a meditation all the time, right? Especially with the practice of meditation.
Yes.
Okay, I should sit down, be quiet. Maybe I have this mantra I'm repeating, and you're trying so hard to control yourself. Whereas
exactly, you have to. It's all about have to and becoming.
Right.
Whereas self-acceptance has nothing to do with becoming. It's about being.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think thoughts, you can observe them and you can let them be and so on, but I'm not a big fan of the idea that you can easily control thoughts. I think it's quite difficult, to be honest.
There are some fans of the Matrix here with us.
Oh, yes.
Manish said love the Matrix for the very same reasons. Lots of people wanted to have Jeff's question answered, so I'm glad we got to that. Let's see. Yeah, right. Patricia says, I do not identify myself as a therapist. That is my profession. So again, it's a comment that shows that there is at least some distance between, the actor and different roles that he or she's playing. Yeah. How about self-acceptance and drug recovery individuals? I'm looking at the nature of this question, and it reminds me very much of the questions that we got in response to the email where we asked people, what do you want to know about meaning and meaning in life, right? Where a lot of people started asking questions like, how can one live a meaningful life after X has happened? So after traumatic experience, after drug abuse, rape, loss of a loved one, and it went on and on like that. But I think, and in this case, it was drug recovery in individuals. I think often, as terrible as a situation like that is, it is not the right question to ask. You see what I mean? So, of course, you want to know, what a meaningful life is or how you can foster self-acceptance after that has happened. But I think the nature of self-acceptance is regardless of whatever has happened. So the principles are still the same, the underlying principles.
Exactly.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, and I think this is also the role that you can take. I think you can inspire clients to become more self-accepting. How? Through your stance, through the way you relate to them. If they're in suffering and you treat them like everyone else, and you treat them no different because of their suffering, and you allow them to be present and to cry and to not judge them, I think this is a starting point for that. Again, with drug recovery, what is the process of drugs often? In essence, it has a lot to do with the loss of self-awareness. Why do people often use drugs? But you can even say television, watching television or spending hours on Facebook. It's all an attempt to reduce self-awareness, to be not concerned with the self, because often that's very painful, because then you start to feel all the things that you have not allowed yourself to feel. So many people are using that to just escape from self-awareness. There's quite a lot of literature on that as well. So I think, so that's moving away from the self. And what is self-acceptance? And it's moving towards the self. It's connecting towards the self, to what you feel and allowing that to be present. So I think the movement towards the self, to allow people to feel what they feel, is a first step. We did a study, it was quite interesting. We did a study for with like more than 100 people in drug recovery, actually, and used mindfulness practice. And you see indeed that self-acceptance increases, self-compassion increases, and all kinds of things related to self-esteem improve. And how can that be? Because I think you change at a very fundamental level how people relate to themselves. This is what does it mean if you say, I am not allowed to feel this, I should not feel this? What you're actually telling me is your relationship with yourself, it's quite a difficult one, because obviously there are things that you cannot accept yourself for. And this is so suppression of thoughts, or constantly having to think positive thoughts, to me it sounds like you're wanting to be something else than you already are. And that, I think there's nothing wrong with wanting to improve yourself and learn and grow. I think, for God's sake, it's beautiful. Look at kids, they have such a strong, beautiful tendency to learn and develop and grow, and they want to explore the world. But that it's not driven by a lack of self-acceptance. That tendency to learn is not driven by an idea that if I do this, I will become good enough.
Right, exactly.
And if I reach this standard, I will finally be. It's not driven by that. It's driven by I'm okay and I can grow.
Yeah, so it's a question that comes up a lot where people ask, like, so if I just accept myself, won't I just sit back and don't do anything, don't engage in any kind of personal development anymore, right?
Question. Yeah, exactly. No, I don't think so. I think it's a very fruitful starting point for developing yourself. But you can feel it, right? You can practice it yourself. Just imagine that you feel very strongly that you're not okay yet, right? It's not good enough. You're not there. And that there are a lot of things you need to do to become good enough. So you need to get that, whatever, promotion or achieve this or that. You feel there is so much attached to getting there. There's like, it's almost like it's like tension that you feel. But now imagine that the starting point is it's okay. You're there. You're good as you are. Let's see what we can do to increase, learn more, develop. Learn new skills and so on. There's a lightness in the second one, right?
Out of that natural human tendency to grow and develop.
Exactly. There's also what self-determination theory, of course, states that people have a human tendency by nature to just develop and grow and experience. And I think this is what you want to tap into.
So it depends on like what kind of place is this coming from? Is this coming from the place of not being good enough, or is this coming from the place of, hey, I'm human, I want to grow, I want to develop further?
So this is also why some of the positive psychology tools are really dangerous. Tools like the best possible self, it's beautiful. It's beautiful to allow people to dream. But if somebody's really low on self-acceptance and asking these people to dream about this best possible self version, it can also become like, oh my God, yet another thing to become, right? To become good enough.
Yeah.
So this is why self-acceptance for me is the starting point of everything.
Right.
I always start from there.
Right, and I think we've been talking about the readiness of a client, right, in the masterclass. I think it's very important to gauge what the level of self-acceptance is, what the readiness is, before bluntly starting with these positive psychology interventions that might make it worse, as you said.
I think so.
It's already been, it's 8 past 4, so maybe we can finish with some, by asking you what your takeaway has been. Like, what is the number one thing that you learned from this, or that you would like to share as a final remark in the chat? So
whatever.
Please let us know, and I'll read some of them out loud as a way of concluding this webinar. Let's see. Okay, lots of people want to are asking to keep in touch, or for the notes and resources. Again, we'll send out an email with all of the resources and a link to the recording for those, of course, who couldn't be here today. Let's see. Self-acceptance is about being, about here and now, not becoming. Reaffirms what I've been doing, says Sue. That's great. That's nice. Could you provide some references for further reading? We're providing those as well, right? You made a list of some recommended readings and references.
Yes, of course.
So we'll be sharing that.
There's also a TED Talk, and there are a lot of beautiful things that I would. Depends a bit on what you want. There is some scientific stuff, but also beyond the field of science, of course.
Right. Differentiation between self-esteem and self-acceptance. That was an important takeaway, right?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, that's it's always very. So I want to add one more thing.
That's what I thought. Go ahead.
So if you consider self-esteem and self-acceptance, right? It is technically possible to have a high level of self-esteem and a low level of self-acceptance, right? You can feel pretty good about yourself because you're meeting all those standards, but if they fall away, you feel miserable about yourself. But the fact that somebody scores high on self-acceptance doesn't mean that he scores low on self-esteem. That person can still be pretty happy with how he performs and so on. So it's not mutually exclusive. Right? So this is something I wanted to add to that. So it's important to remember. But I don't think we should help people build self-esteem. I think there's also a beautiful article that I will send you guys. It's called "Why We Don't Need Self-Esteem." It's perfectly in line with the story.
Yeah, I think Baumeister showed that self-esteem is not something you want to pursue. Was it Baumeister's article?
Among others, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so Carol says, "Don't be your story." I like that.
Beautiful.
I love the connection between self-acceptance and a growth mindset. Mary says, "I like the clarification of functional perfectionism versus dysfunctional perfectionism." Diane says, "The role we play and not getting too connected to the role versus relevant in the public sector." Oh, very relevant in the public sector, she says. Yeah.
Because if you move beyond the role, you can really connect to the human being behind the role. If you can feel it, the more we get identified with the role, the more we start to be inauthentic in a way. And we confuse ourselves with all the standards that apply to that rule, the way we should behave in line with it. You should act professionally, right? So guys, I'm here to teach you a bit about it. So you get into a role, right? And you automatically lose connection with people.
Right.
In my opinion. But everybody does it. I do it as well. We all lose ourselves in roles, and that's okay. Then self-acceptance kicks in again. It's okay to do that. You're a human being. But the more you become aware of it, the easier it becomes. It's a process.
Nice. You have to feel to heal. Yeah. Amy said that. Great one sentence summary as well.
Yeah, beautiful.
Be alone with yourself from time to time. I think that's a great takeaway as well, Alexandra.
Spend time alone, not doing anything, not being. Is it the word like functional? Not being. We're driven by things. We have to be useful. That's the word I was looking for. We all have to be useful and productive. And so deliberately spend time alone, not being productive. Spend time with young kids, playing around, just having fun, not doing anything that is productive.
Maybe it's as an exercise, to kind of throw that idea out there, to take a Saturday where you put your phone and your laptop and your books and your Kindle and whatever, and try to be not productive for one day. Just don't do anything that's productive.
Because again, that's for me personally, that's been a rule for a very long time and sometimes to be productive. I have to be productive. It's like a programming. I am okay if I'm productive.
Right.
You produce something of value. So you're constantly, without knowing it, driving yourself crazy because of all the things you feel you have to do.
Yeah. I mean, how many Mondays have you had in your life where you weren't being a slave to your own master and being productive? How many Mondays in your life, man?
It's crazy if you think of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Love the webinar. Would love to connect with fellow clinical psychologists and psychotherapists. I think that's a great thing about this chat. People can also interact with each other. It's not just us. So I've been seeing some connection among the participants. I love listening to both of you. Thank you from Mississippi, says Julia. Thank you, Julia. for being here. Self-acceptance is a topic that is very important in our current society that dispenses negativity and judgments of others, says Marcia. Self-acceptance is positive well-being, says Michelle. I think they're definitely related. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Grateful for this webinar. Thanks for the program. I love the messages and hopes you mentioned for your children. Be a friend to yourself. Live inside out. Yeah, absolutely. And then there's a lot of gratitude from people who've attended the webinar. So thank you so much for sharing this moment with us. As we said, this was the first webinar. It was kind of a tryout, but I think we'll maybe next week, but we'll definitely do it more often, right?
Yeah, I would love to do it. I would love to hear your view on that as well. And if you have any preferences or suggested topics, I would love to hear them.
Yeah. So if you already have something in mind, like I would like to have a conversation with you guys about this, please let us know in the chat. We'll make an export of the chat and go through it to look for topics that we can cover in the future. For now, have a great rest of the day. I know those of you who are in the United States still have the whole day ahead of you. For us, it's not dinner time yet, but we're getting there. It's 4:00 here in the afternoon in the Netherlands. And
take care.
That was it. Take care.
Goodbye, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.